at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. I'm studying environmental education and interpretation, and thank you all for coming to my talk here today. Before we get started, I'm going to kind of put you to the test to see what you know about Stevens Point, maybe a little bit about its history, and actually one tree in particular that I think happens to be the most maybe influential, important, or one of the most valuable trees that has really affected Wisconsin and Stevens Point. So I'm going to be showing you some pictures of different parts of this tree. If you know what this tree is, please just keep it to yourself. We're going to give everybody equal time to try to figure out what this particular tree is. If you don't know trees very well, that's okay too. I'll be talking about this one in particular throughout the night. So we'll get started. Some can recognize this tree by looking at the whole tree itself and its habitat. Maybe as a yearling or a small tree just growing up. Some can recognize this tree by its very distinct, I think, bark. Now, the bark can vary from tree to tree, but it's all representing the same tree. Like I said, in various stages, but I think very distinct still. Some can recognize this tree by its needles. I have some needles up here from this tree, and they come in groups of 5. So there are 5 needles in every fascicle or bundle on this tree. So that might help you figure out what this tree is. I'll actually pass this around maybe to get a first-hand chance to see it. Maybe that'll help you out. It has very characteristic whorls on the tree itself. Now some can recognize it by its cones. And it comes in all different shapes and sizes. We have small, medium, what I like to call supersize. So the cones can differ, but they're all pretty much the same shape and very distinctive once again. Some can recognize it maybe by the needles, the tree, and the cone all together. So let's go back to the original picture and see the complete picture. Does anybody know what this important and influential tree is in Wisconsin's history? Yes, this is the white pine. Very good. Now, white pine is an interesting material. It's very lightweight, it's strong, and it's durable, and it's easy to work with. And it's actually the leading source for paper products and building materials. And white pine cut in Wisconsin actually helped build our cities, our towns, businesses, and houses more than a century ago. Some interesting facts about pine. It's found on 6 out of our 7 continents. Now, does anybody want to take a guess at the continent it doesn't grow on? Yeah, exactly. Antarctica is not even on this map. So anywhere else you could possibly find a variety or species of pine. Now, talking about species, there's quite a number of them, or different types of pine. Does anybody want to take a gander as to how many different species there are? There's things like red pine, white pine, like we already said, jack pine. There's more than 3. I'll give you that answer. Does anybody have a guess? Scotch. There's Scotch pine, so it's more than 4. Yes? 16. 16? It's more than 16. Does anybody else want to venture a guess? 200. 200? In between 16 and 200. There's actually 120 different varieties of pine, so it's pretty important. And why we're talking about pine is because it's very important in the Wisconsin logging history. And I'm also going to test you on this. So if I could get a couple of volunteers to come up here, and I'll hand you a little axe, and you can come place it where you think the Wisconsin logging, the one that we're going to be talking about today, took place. So I gave you a range. It's somewhere in between 1700 and today, 2010. So a couple of volunteers, if I can get you to come up here. Don't worry if you don't get it right, it's okay. So you can come up. Yeah. Just place it wherever you think. So anybody else want to come up and take a guess? else want to gander in? All right, so we think here, what do you guys think? They did a good job? All right, so they did fall actually right in there. So you guys got kind of the early logging history in Wisconsin. So nice job. So the Wisconsin logging actually took place from about the 1830s to the 1890s, a little bit early in the 1900s itself. The peak year was really 1899. So why we're all here today is because the Stevens Point is known as the gateway to the Pineries. But I did this talk because being in Stevens Point, going to college here, I wondered how many people in Stevens Point really knew what that meant, being the gateway to the Pineries. So you see it when you come into town. I saw it on your shirt actually earlier today, and then some people on your garbage cans or your recycling cans, if you're citizens in Stevens Point, it even has it on the side of there. So gateway to the Pineries. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So the logging history, how that logging history really influenced us as a city, and what we're actually doing today to kind of keep that legacy, that logging legacy alive as well. So, 1869, in Wisconsin, there was actually 1 billion board feet of white pine cut and extracted. Now, a board foot, if you're unfamiliar with that term, I went to our forest lab on campus and had a board foot cut out of white pine. So it's 12 inches wide by 12 inches long, and it's 1 inch thick. So that'll give you some kind of bearing as to what a board foot is. Now I'm going to pass this around, and you can really see how lightweight pine actually is. We were talking about that property of the wood itself. So 1 billion board feet was taken out of Wisconsin in 1869. But as I said, the peak year was actually 1899, where actually more than 3 billion board feet were taken out of Wisconsin in 1 year alone. So if you can imagine that, it's still pretty hard to fathom though. So if you can imagine 3 billion of those boards being taken out. I gotta admit, I'm kind of a math nerd. I really like crunching numbers and doing the math and calculating things out. Everything really until calculus, I was all good with my math, but it's another story. So I wanted to figure out how much this really is. 3 billion board feet is really hard for me to fathom. So I figured it out. If we stacked 3 billion of those on top of each other, we could actually go around the earth twice. And this is how much wood was taken out of Wisconsin in 1 year alone, 1899. Now I want to take it one step further, because I told you I'm a geek and a math nerd, so you can actually, if you stack them end to end, so the 12 inches by 12 inches right next to each other, you can actually get to the moon and back with that 3 billion board feet. So you can imagine, that's a lot of wood coming out of one state at one time. And it left the landscape pretty devastated and influenced it a lot. But fortunately, we've actually regained a lot of our forest cover today. Now you can see here, Wisconsin. It's kind of hard to see on this image, but the green area is the forest cover that we have nowadays. So some of our forests have returned, but it's obviously nowhere near where it was before it was developed and logged. So now, we're talking about new land and new opportunities. Where did logging really come from? Did somebody just come up with it one day? There's a lot of trees out here. What a good idea to cut them down. Maybe. But actually it was new land that really opened up this opportunity. And before, somebody else owned this land that we're in right now. And that was actually the Native Americans. And this land was ceded to the the United States government in 1836 in the Treaty of Cedar Point. I was talking about this area here on the map. Now is this area, for those of you who are familiar with this area of Wisconsin, do you know what this follows nicely on a state map of Wisconsin?
The river.
Yeah, if we overlay a state map, follows really nicely with the Wisconsin River. So, this new land was given to us, or ceded to us, and it really presented new opportunities for people. So logging before this time was a pretty minor industry. Not a lot of people really participated in it, but since this new land was given us with a bounty of trees, it really opened up the doors for logging. especially along the Wisconsin River and in Stevens Point in particular. So white settlers saw this as a great opportunity to move in, to expand this logging business. Obviously jobs and money were one of the most important things that they were looking for. Now one of the people I'm going to be talking about today is John B. Dubé. Has anybody ever heard that name before? I don't know what it's associated with.
Well, there's Lake Bay just.
Yeah, Lake Dubé. Now is that south or north of Stevens Point? North of Stevens Point. It's about 12 miles north to be exactly. So in the 1830s, John Dubé came here and set up a trading post there for the loggers and kind of the people working in that area. Now the next person we're going to be talking about is actually George Stevens. Does anybody want to guess where he might fit in there? Well, obviously, Stevens is the Stevens of Stevens Point. And he came here in 1838 with a Native American as his companion or kind of counterpart. And they looked around this area, they conducted the real first land survey of this area. And Stevens came back in 1839 to Charlotte Rapids and actually bought a little shack. Now the shack was located in modern day Stevens Point. This is where he stored a lot of his supplies for his operations north of here, which is modern day Mosinee. Now, Charlotte Rapids is actually commemorated, and if you're from Stevens Point, you may have seen this before. It's on the west end of Main Street by the Riverfront Arts Center. And at that exact place is this plaque dedicated to George Stevens, and really is where Charlotte Rapids and his shack once stood. So this rock in itself and this plaque really symbolize the founding of the city itself by George Stevens. So if you're from the area, you can go check this out. I think it's really interesting to know you're standing exactly where his shack once stood. So we're talking the population of Stevens Point around this time, 1850, is about 200 people. So just keep that in mind. We'll see what the logging industry will do. So these new opportunities and the new land presented this new job, which brought along with it new dangers. Now this job was lumberjacking, or being out in the woods cutting down these trees, these big white pines. But it really provided a livelihood for them to support their family with. But like I said before, it was a very dangerous job. They worked amid falling trees in very dangerous and remote conditions, and basically what they could carry in was on their back. And it usually was saws, it was axes, it was tools for the trade. You didn't have all the modern day luxuries. Whatever they had with them is what they had. And in these dangerous conditions, it wasn't very much. To kind of demonstrate how dangerous this job really was, I found an article from the Bayfield Press in Duluth, so a little north of here, but it's the same trade. This is 1909. Theodore Kerwin of Duluth was killed Wednesday at the camp of the Schroeder Lumber Company on Presque Isle, which is now Stockton Island, if you're familiar with that area. And he was standing near the landing, and for some unknown reason, or in some unknown manner, a log fell, bringing several more of it with it, which knocked the man down, rolling him over, and crushing out his life. So talk about a headline and a bad day, obviously. This was a very dangerous field, but they were willing to go through it because they were very proud of the work they did. They took down trees that were over 100, 200, possibly over 300 years old. They took their job very seriously and were very meticulous in their work. And after they felled the log, they usually had to cut it into smaller sections. About 16-foot sections are what they would transport it eventually into the mill. They obviously did have some time to stop for a mug shot, like this one was actually the cover of Life magazine in the early 1900s. So once again, like I said,